Hey everyone, welcome to Sequence of Instructions. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be learning about data types. This is the second video in our series Learning to Code. The first video was about variables. If you haven't got a chance to view it, I encourage you to. I'm going to link to it in the description of this video. But let's dive in. So as before, I'm on jsbin.com. We'll be learning data types as they relate to JavaScript, but the concept extends to almost every programming language. You may recall in the last video, we saw we can declare and assign values to variables like this, and all of the variables we were working with were numbers. So we were able to do arithmetic with them, we could add them, we could divide them, we could multiply them. But what if you wanted to store something different than a number? What if you wanted to store your name? Could you do that? And the answer is yes. There's different types of data that we can store. We can store numbers, we can store decimal numbers, we can store names, those are called strings. So we're going to be learning about a few of those here. So again, this is a number. There's an interesting tool in JavaScript called typeof. So in the same way that this var character is a keyword, has a special meaning, it's used to declare a new variable, there's a keyword called typeof, and you basically say typeof and you give it a variable. And this is going to give you, this type of x is going to tell me what type of data x is. And I said before that it's a number. Hopefully, if nothing's changed, which I don't think it has, when we log the type of x, we should see number printed to the console here. Because remember, we're console logging. And there it is. X is a number. Well, I said before that you can have decimal numbers. So let's maybe make a y and say it's 10.3. Well, what type of number is that? Let's find out. So we're going to say console.log type of y. And let's see, what do we get? Number. So even though it's a decimal, in JavaScript, it's still considered a number. They have this generic umbrella term called number. In other languages, you'll see a whole number, like 5, expressed as what's called an integer type. And a decimal number, like 10.3, would be defined as a floating point number. But in JavaScript, we don't make this distinction, and so y, even though it's a float, is still considered a number, quote-unquote number. Okay, let's look at another type. What about if I did, and again, you can name your variables whatever you want. I'm using relatively semantic names, x, y, often variables found in math, and now I'm naming this variable name. And we're going to say the name is John. Okay, so this is distinctly different than a number, and you can tell that in a few ways. One, I have no numbers in this sequence, but don't rely only on that, because I could very well have said my name is 10, right? And we'll get into that in a little bit. But the big distinction here that this is not a number are these things, these double quotes that I added. And these double quotes are an indication to JavaScript that I'm not declaring a number type, I'm declaring a completely different type. Before I tell you what it is, let's find out what it is. If you're following along, feel free to do this on your own. We're going to console.log, which means we're going to print to the console the type of the data type that is the variable name. What data type are we working with here? So let's see. It's a string, a totally new type that we haven't talked about yet. String is computer programmer talk for string of characters. So each one of these, J-O-H-N, each one of those is considered a character type. In other languages, like C++, like C++, each letters like J would be considered a data type that is a character. And a string of characters would be a different data type that says this is more than one character. But again, JavaScript doesn't make a distinction between multiple characters or one character. You'll see here if I run it with just J, it's still a string. And that's actually, that's JavaScript trying to be helpful. So you don't have to worry about all these micro primitive types. There are these larger macro types you just have to be concerned about. But so that's a string. And I said that you can't just rely on the characters used, because I could very well do this, in which case the question becomes, well, what is this? I mean, this is a number. To the human's eye, this is the number 10. But to JavaScript, and this is an important distinction, this isn't a number 10. This is the word 10 written numerically. So if we run this, we're not going to see that the type of name isn't number because we've defined it as a string here. So if we run this, we'll still see that name is a string, even though to our human eyes, this appears to be a number. So that's an important, I don't want to call it an obstacle, but it's an important thing to be aware of, because in your programming today and later on in life, if you pursue it, you're going to encounter this type difference often. You're going to think something is a number because it has this numeric value, and you're not going to realize, oh, actually, it's a string, and JavaScript is going to treat it slightly differently. There's other data types that we might be covering. Well, there's a few more data types that we're going to be covering in later videos, but there's one more primitive data type I want to get into. Primitive meaning it's found in it's in compiled languages like C++. It relates directly to the memory. So variables reference single packets of memory. So this final type I'm going to get into, I'm going to challenge you and see if you can figure it out. So you can maybe recall taking tests. There were written answers, which if you were to store the result of that written answer, you might store it as a string, right? So if I asked, explain what your favorite part of the book was, and there was like 3 lines to write on, you'd know that the response you're going to be giving is going to be a string response, right? Or sometimes on tests, you might see, like especially if it's a math test, there'll be some equation and you'll have to solve for x, and in that case, you're going to be giving your teacher a numeric response. You're going to be giving them a number as the answer. And there's one final type that relates directly to what we're talking about, and that is those true-false questions that you might get on a test. And those will say, they'll give you a statement, and they'll say, is this statement true or false? And you're simply going to respond with true, or you're going to respond with false. And in programming, we call that type a boolean. So I can have this, we'll say, I don't know, is correct. Is the answer correct? And I can store either false in it, or I can store true in it. And you'll see, it might be hard to see on your screen here, but true and false are being colored differently than, they're not red, they're not green as this number is, they're this interesting color of blue. And that's another indication that this is a keyword. So let's find out what type this is. We'll console.log type of is correct. That's the variable that's the variable name I gave it. And we'll see it is a boolean. So var is correct equals true. This gives us a boolean value. And boolean values can only ever be true or false. So I can say is correct as true, or I can say is correct as false. And it doesn't matter. It's always going to be a boolean. But the second I gave it if I don't say true or false, if I say it's 5, which doesn't answer the question, is it correct? You'll see that, oh, it's back to a number. This is no longer a boolean value. Boolean, what am I doing? True. Okay. Anyway, that's it for these primitive data types. We're going to do another video in the future once we learn about manipulating and using these a little bit. Once we're comfortable with the primitive types, we're going to do another video about more complex data types. If you're looking to read ahead a little bit before we get into there, we're going to cover things like arrays, objects, and the data type JavaScript is maybe most known for, functions. In JavaScript, functions are data types. But before we get into all of that, there's a few other things we got to learn. So stay tuned for a video on these complex data types to come. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.